By the end of this module, you will understand how confident leadership during change comes from setting direction without waiting for clear alignment. You will be able to distinguish between predictability and movement, communicate decisions with honesty and steadiness, and adjust course deliberately without weakening credibility. Most importantly, you will leave with a practical way to lead forward even when information is incomplete, so unpredictability becomes manageable instead of paralyzing. At senior levels, that capability is not optional. It's what prevents hesitation, second-guessing, and paralysis. Most leadership breakdowns during change don't happen because leaders make the wrong decision. They happen because leaders stop deciding and the organization starts drifting. Apprehension increases, information is incomplete, and managers wait for clarity that never fully arrives. You've probably seen this before. Plans get labeled tentative. Direction becomes conditional. Decisions get deferred. People sense the hesitation immediately, and momentum quietly drains away. At this level, uncertainty isn't the problem. Avoidance is. When leaders wait for full assurance before setting direction, the system fills the gap with speculation, anxiety, and noise. Not because people lack resilience, but because leadership has gone quiet. I remember leading through a period where information changed week to week. Our organization was undergoing a major restructure, and teams would be meaningfully impacted. So naturally, my team was on pins and needles to find out how they would be affected. And there was a temptation to wait, to hold off, to avoid giving information that was subject to change. What I learned was that people didn't need guarantees. What they needed was to understand how decisions would be made as things evolved. Many managers believe confidence comes from having answers. At this level, confidence comes from having a process for deciding. When leaders confuse the two, they either overpromise or they say nothing at all, and both undermine trust. So here's the distinction to hold on to. Leaders don't eliminate shifting conditions. They prevent it from paralyzing the work. Direction is still required even when outcomes aren't guaranteed. In the next part of this module, we'll look at how leaders set direction without pretending to know the ending. Because confidence under uncertainty isn't about certainty. It's about judgment. One of the most damaging assumptions leaders make during change is that direction requires clarity. It doesn't. Direction and clarity are not the same thing. Many managers delay direction because they're waiting for more information. They tell themselves, we'll know more soon. Let's wait for confirmation. It's too early to say. But what they're really doing is equating leadership with accuracy, and that stalls momentum. Direction is not a prediction. Direction answers a simpler question. So your leadership check-in question is, given what we know right now, how are we moving forward? That's it. Direction is provisional by design. During change, people don't expect guarantees. They expect orientation. They want to know, what are we focusing on now? What matters most in this phase, and how decisions will be revisited if things do change. When leaders provide that, the shifting conditions become manageable. Confidence under unpredictability doesn't come from knowing the outcome. It comes from being explicit about what's decided, what's still open, and when reassessment will happen. That clarity builds trust faster than false assurance ever could. Here's the distinction to remember. You won't always know the outcome, but you're still responsible for the direction. Leadership is steady movement, especially when variables change, like when budgets shift, policies change, and your team looks to you for what happens next. Before communicating during times of change, ask yourself this leadership check-in question. What is stable enough to decide right now? Even in volatile situations, something usually is. Naming that creates traction. When leaders avoid setting direction, people fill the gap with speculation. Energy scatters and credibility erodes quietly. Not because leaders were wrong, but because they were absent. Setting direction without decisiveness is only half the work. The next challenge is holding confidence without overpromising or locking yourself in. And that's what we'll tackle next. Once leaders set direction without clear alignment, a new tension appears. Your leadership check-in question. How do I sound confident without pretending I know more than I do? And that tension is real, and it's where many leaders slip. Under pressure, leaders tend to fall into one of two traps. The first is overpromising. They speak with strategic conviction that they don't actually have. They close off options too early. They reassure people with statements that they later have to walk back. The second is hedging. They soften everything. They add disclaimers. They sound unsure, even when the direction itself is solid. Both erode credibility over time. Confidence is not clarity. Confidence is steadiness. It's the ability to say, this is what we're doing now. This is what we're watching, and this is how we'll adjust if needed. That stance is honest, and it holds. Here's the formula that protects credibility during change. Be clear about what's decided. Be honest about what isn't, and be explicit about how updates will happen. You don't need to sound definitive. You need to sound intentional. In practice, confident communication under uncertainty sounds like this. Here's what we're doing in this phase. Here's what could change. Here's when we'll revisit this. Notice what's missing. There's no predictions, no guarantees, and no defensive language. When leaders stop overpromising, they stop backpedaling, they stop re-explaining, and they stop carrying credibility debt. Trust becomes easier to maintain because it's built on transparency, not predictability. Before communicating during uncertainty, ask yourself this leadership check-in question. Am I trying to sound confident or be credible? If it's credibility, the right words usually follow. Confidence that lasts doesn't come from having answers. It comes from being clear about how leadership will operate when answers aren't available. Of course, change doesn't unfold neatly. Information shifts, conditions evolve, and leaders have to update direction without undermining trust. That's the final piece we'll tackle next. There's a moment in every period of change that leaders dread. New information arrives, conditions shift, and the original direction no longer fully holds. This is where many leaders worry about losing credibility. Faced with change, managers often react in one of two ways. They either cling to the original direction longer than they should, or they over-explain the change to protect their image. Both approaches weaken trust. Credibility doesn't come from never changing course. It comes from changing course deliberately. Leaders lose credibility when change looks reactive, defensive, or unanchored. They gain credibility when updates are grounded in judgment. I remember having to adjust direction after new information surfaced. My instinct was to explain everything that led up to the change because I feared that the team would think that I'd been withholding information. What actually worked was much simpler. I named what had changed and what that meant for our next move to keep the focus on forward movement. No justification, no apology, just leadership. When direction needs to change, use this structure. Here's what changed, here's what still holds, and here's what we're doing next. That's it. This structure keeps updates focused on movement, not on defending past decisions. In practice, credible updates sound like this. Based on new information, this part of our plan is shifting. Our overall priority remains the same. Here's how we're adjusting and what happens next. No blame, no revisionist history, no over-processing. During change, people aren't tracking whether you were right. They're watching how you respond when things don't go as planned. Calm adjustment builds more trust than stubborn consistency ever will. Here's the distinction to remember. Changing direction doesn't weaken leadership. Changing it without clarity does. When leaders update direction with intent, credibility holds. When you need to adjust course, ask yourself this leadership check-in question. Am I updating direction or defending myself? If it's direction, trust stays intact. In the wrap-up for this module, we'll pull these pieces together. How leaders maintain confidence without having all the answers, how direction holds even as conditions change, and how judgment becomes the anchor when clarity is incomplete. In this module, we didn't try to eliminate volatility. We focused on how leaders operate when the path isn't fully visible. Because at this level, waiting for clarity is not a leadership strategy. The habit we retired here was subtle but costly, waiting for full alignment before setting direction. That habit feels careful, but it quietly creates drift. And drift erodes confidence faster than a wrong decision ever will. That's why we replace that habit with this operating rule. I lead through shifting conditions by setting direction that can be adjusted, not avoided. Your stop doing commitment. I want you to choose one decision this week that you would normally delay while waiting for more certainty. Commit to setting a provisional direction instead, making clear what is decided now and when it will be revisited. That rule does important work. It allows movement without rigidity, confidence without pretense, and credibility without overpromising. We started by looking at why uncertainty often causes leaders to stall. Then we separated direction from certainty. We talked about how to hold confidence without locking yourself into promises that you can't keep. And finally, we addressed how leaders adjust direction without undermining trust. Leadership during change doesn't feel like having all the answers. It feels like steadiness. People know where they're headed. They know what matters now, and they trust that adjustments will be made deliberately. That's confidence built on judgment. If change still feels destabilizing, it's usually because direction hasn't been claimed clearly enough. Not because leaders lack information, but because they've avoided deciding with what they already know. In the next module, we'll move into strategic thinking and decision-making. Not strategy as planning documents, but strategy as choosing where attention, time, and effort actually go. We'll look at how leaders make decisions that matter instead of staying busy with ones that don't. Because at this level, clarity is not about doing more, It's about deciding what deserves focus. The field application. In the next week, notice one situation where uncertainty is slowing momentum. Identify what is stable enough to decide today. Communicate that direction clearly and state when it will be reassessed. Observe what changes in clarity, confidence, or team movement. For now, notice one thing. The next time uncertainty shows up, ask yourself what direction is stable enough to set today. That answer is where your leadership has leverage, even when certainty is unavailable.